Good morning to one and all. David. It is on. There should be on every table Birkat Hamazon cards, and I'm going to ask Rosie to come forward and lead us in Birkat Hamazon. And immediately thereafter, we will begin our program this morning. So Rosie, come on up. Stand close. What?
No, sure, I'm out.
Maybe an hour of an hour. I'll go November 4th, I don't think. Good morning to one and all.
Good morning.
And welcome to the annual Rabbi Alexander M. Shapiro Memorial Lecture and Brunch. And I hope you are enjoying the brunch, and I think it is most appropriate to say that Rabbi Shapiro would be delighted at the sight of members of this congregation gathering together in camaraderie, friendship, joy, to enjoy each other's company, and of course to be here to learn Torah together. And we have invited a remarkable scholar as our guest today, and we will hear from him in a few moments. The events of the past week plus already have shocked us all. The violation of the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the intrusion with violence in the lives of 11 families, 11 victims of hatred and anti-Semitism, and members of the congregations that shared Jewish life in Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and with a ripple effect through wider communities and circles of people who have been deeply, deeply upset and anguished over these events. They have caused us to be reflective, caused us to think about our Judaism, our American identity, and perhaps most important, what can and should we do to fight and defeat anti-Semitism and racism and all forms of exclusion of human beings from the community of people who share this world. And I think about this in particular today, because among the many virtues in Rabbi Shapiro's rabbinate, in his very life, which gave birth to his rabbinate, was a love of people, desire and capacity to see in people that we all are made in the image of God, and we all bear the spark of divine light. Those who remember Rabbi Shapiro will, of course, know immediately that he would have been at the forefront of fighting those terrible isms that affect and weaken our society. He would have been among the loudest voices, calling for fair treatment of all human beings, whether they be citizens of this country, refugees, immigrants. He would have been in the forefront of people, demanding justice, demanding dignity. And as we gather here today, still feeling a sense of shock from what happened 8 days ago, let us remember lovingly a leader who in his time and whose words and example reverberate to this day, still set an example for all of us. I'm now going to call on Kevin Katz to come forward as president of Oak Shalom Congregation. I think it's absolutely correct to say that Rabbi Shapiro would have been very proud of you, Kevin, for embracing the mantle of leadership and caring so deeply about this congregation. I ask Kevin to come forward and offer some words of greeting to us all. Thank you, Rabbi.
Good morning, Ohev Shalom.
Good morning.
This has been an absolutely fantastic weekend here at Ohev for those of you that have been here Friday and yesterday and today as well. Friday, for those of you that were not here, we had First Friday. We had the largest First Friday in the history of Ohev Shalom. We had approximately 240 people, depending on who you ask. And we were too big for the chapel. We had to go into the sanctuary. What a great problem that is. And then yesterday we had a bar mitzvah for Ethan Parlin, who was amazing, as many of you may have seen. And today we're here. So what a great, terrific weekend, Ohev Shalom. And if it couldn't get any better, we have a birthday amongst us that I want to mention. Arlene Silkovitz's birthday today. Happy birthday, Arlene. But I'm thrilled that you're all here. I'm thrilled to be here, and I know we have a great morning ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I want to call on Ed Zinbarg, who had a very close and meaningful relationship with Rabbi Shapiro, and I've asked him to come forward today to share a few words of memory and reminiscence.
Morning. Morning. Each of us, I'm sure, can point to one or two individuals, in addition to our parents, who profoundly influenced our lives. For Barbara and me, Alex Shapiro was one of those people. He demonstrated not only by his words, but as Rabbi Cooper pointed out, by his actions, that Jewish values have to be brought into every aspect of our everyday lives. His untimely early passing found Barbara and me often saying to each other, to this day, when we face some kind of dilemma, what would Alex have advised? That's how important his influence was for us. He and I differed, I'm an economist, and he and I differed frequently about what the ideal political economy would look like. He believed that Jewish values would suggest that the ideal society worldwide, but in America, would be socialist. He was not shy about using that word. I pointed out to him frequently that, after all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were very wealthy men. And the accumulation of wealth was a Torah value. He said, yeah, that's true. But Moses and the prophets weren't wealthy men, and they were more important for Jewish history than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Alex was a student of ancient responsa literature. Responsa, for those of you who don't know, people in the community would write to their rabbis or ask their rabbis, if they didn't know how to write, questions about their lives, and the rabbis would write letters called responsa, giving them advice. Alex was frequently pointing out in his sermons that because he was so embedded in that history, those of us who complained about, all the problems of our day and what's going to happen to Judaism, he said, look, I've studied this for centuries, and the problems are still the same, but Judaism survives. One Shabbos, I recall distinctly, I went over to him during Kiddush and I said, Alex, how can you be so optimistic in the face of all that history? And I'll never forget his shy smile, although he spoke out. He was really a very shy man, and he had a beautiful, shy smile. And he said to me, Ed, that's why I'm a rabbi. I'll never forget those words. May the memory of that shy and gentle, yet very inspirational human being be a blessing to all of us.
Thank you so much, Ed, for your beautiful words. Those who knew Rabbi Shapiro also are very aware of his passionate commitment to the state of Israel, to Zionism, to the people of Israel. He was an ardent Zionist. So it seems appropriate that today, when we still feel the importance of Israel's milestone anniversary, its 70th anniversary having been celebrated not terribly long ago, and with a sense of a bit of turbulence in the relationship between Israel and the other epicenter of world Jewry here in North America, that we asked Rabbi Starr to be our scholar and our teacher here today, to talk with us about Israel and the diaspora at 70. Rabbi Starr is the founder and executive director of CIO, Program of Education in the History and Ideas of Zionism and the State of Israel. He is a superb teacher on the faculty of the Gaon Academy, the Wexner Foundation, Hebrew College's MEA program, which he founded. He has served as scholar in residence in various important locations, and at Hebrew College as a dean and vice president for community education, rabbi at Harvard Radcliffe Hillel, the Bronfman Chair in Jewish Communal Innovation at Brandeis University. He received his PhD in History and Jewish Studies from Columbia. He's ordained as a rabbi at JTS. He lives in Boston with his wife and daughters, and we're pleased and honored to welcome Rabbi David Starr to speak to us today about Israel and the diaspora at 70. Rabbi Starr will speak for about 30 minutes, no promises to be exact there, about 30 minutes, and then we're inviting comments and questions for discussion. And near the end of our program, we'll hear, as we do each year, from Ruth, and this year from Nomi as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Cooper. A lot of thanks to the Shapiros for risking the popularity of this wonderful, important occasion by asking me to come and talk. I hope I won't put a dent in it. I would feel very badly about that. To Betty for your ongoing support for this. I know it comes from a very deep place in terms of you and your late husband's relationship with the Shapiros. To the congregation, I have to say also, as somebody who's writing the biography of Solomon Schechter, I know that one of the rabbis who preceded Alex here was Charles Hoffman, who was a very close colleague and student of Solomon Schechter, about whom I'm writing. So this is a place that's very dear to me, and of course to Dave and Nomi and all of your family, Ruth. I would say, just parenthetically, you know, rabbis need mentors. We think of students as needing mentors, but we oftentimes, of course, Ricky, I'm sorry that I left you out, of course, my dear friend Rick Cantor-Livitz. We think of students as needing mentors, but not always professionals. And that is a terrible mistake, very short-sighted. I certainly have a very strong memory when Dave and I graduated from JTS in 1990 of how much we cherished, Dave obviously from a much closer place than I, cherished our relationship with Alex as a mentor, and it was a source of great comfort to me, and inspiration, and information, and I just need to say that to you, Ruth. I mean, in terms of the beautiful words that other people said about him, all of which were spot on. I think and it's a great pity that he didn't have the opportunity to mentor, I think, even more students and then professionals in the field of the rabbinate. So yes, I want to talk about Israel and the diaspora today. It is something that I just came back from the GA at a conference in which I was actually with Amy and Mark at for a time. And people have mentioned the fact that this is a very big number. 70 is a big number in Jewish life, the notion of attaining maturity. So it's a big number in terms of the life of Israel. And as you may know, there was a lot of energy invested at the GA around this question of, you know, do we need to have some sort of reset in the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. I know that Alex, I hope, would have wanted to talk about this, since you, Ruth, and Alex really gave your lives to things that are core aspects of the miracle that has really been Zionism in Israel. Hebrew language, Hebrew literacy, Hebrew culture, actually living in Israel, raising your kids to love those things, and to be those things in a very deep way, on the one hand. On the other hand, you built a very rich life in the diaspora. And I think it was a mark of personal and intellectual integrity that, in effect, you really embodied the tensions and the contradictions and the congruences, all of those different things that really define what it means to be a Jew who, on the one hand, believes in diaspora, but also believes in Eretz Yisrael and Zionism. So that's really what I want to talk about. I will tell you that, and Rabbi Cooper and I had an opportunity to discuss this together. I am not a person who believes in telling people why they should do things. I'm not here to preach at you. I'm here to study something with you together, and the way that I think about what it means to learn is that, you know, and there are texts around the table that the office was good enough to make, of two different texts that we're going to look at. You will take those texts seriously, and in turn, I will take your autonomy seriously as human beings, as adults, as Jews, and you will form whatever conclusions, you'll ask whatever questions you want, and that's what we're going to do. And I think that that's what Alex would most want you to do. So, all right, what does it mean to think about these two communities in the context of Jewish history? We're going to be taking a look at two texts, one of which is from 1950, a very famous exchange between David Ben-Gurion, who was at the time the prime minister, the first prime minister of the state of Israel. Israel's only 2 years old at that point. And Jacob Blaustein, who was the president of the American Jewish Committee at that time, a very successful lay leader and businessman and philanthropist in American Jewish life. He was from Baltimore. He was in the petroleum business, if I'm not mistaken. And what we're going to look at first in a few seconds is an exchange that they had about thinking out loud together about what the relationship between Israel and American Jewry ought to be. And then the second text is a text that actually I had the opportunity to read just a couple weeks ago in Tel Aviv, that has been put forward by some people, some lay leaders from both Israel as well as the United States, under the auspices of the Wexner Foundation, but that's not really so important, who are in effect sort of thinking about what would it mean to have a 2018 version of the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein conversation, meaning should we be having a new conversation as two Jewish communities together. So, I want to, before I do that, since I'm a historian, I always have to jump back into the past before we march forward. I want to start by thinking about a philosophical and historical question with you, which is this question of what are the Jews? Right? And here I want to give you two options. Are the Jews a nation, or are they a religion? Okay, now the classical answer to that question was they're really both. It's a kind of a braiding, a kind of a synthesis of a nation, a religion, and a culture. right? We had a national identity. It goes back to the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, of course, we're not quite there yet. We're still in the book of Bereshit and the book of Genesis, which in effect is the prequel to this. But when we get to the most important book in the Bible, which is the book of Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, we will in effect be reading the birth of the Jewish nation. That's the energy of the change from Genesis to Exodus. That's really what is driving the book forward, is the creation of the nation on the one hand, and living in this covenantal relationship with God on the other. On the other hand, so that's clearly, the national piece I think is there front and center. On the other hand, one of the major things that defines and expresses that sense of people, that sense of national identity, is the Jewish stuff. Right? In the Tanakh, it's the Mishkan, right? The tabernacle, the cult, the sacrificial piece, right? That then gives way to the Beit HaMikdash, home ritual that obviously expands greatly when the temple is destroyed, and you get this whole notion of rabbinic culture, both in the land of Israel, but also outside the land of Israel, study, prayer, acts of loving kindness, ritual, theology, and the like. And then culture, obviously, is sort of the way, some of the forms that takes, language, literature, and the like. So if somebody had asked, it was mentioned that Alex was a student of responsa for the Middle Ages. If somebody had come to a medieval rabbi and said, oh, what are the Jews, a religion or a culture, or a religion or a nation? The medieval rabbi would have said, well, it's not even, they're both. I mean, you can't really separate the two. So what changes? What changes is really the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, things like the French Revolution, the opportunity of Jews to become citizens in new states, first in places like France, but also in the United States. The opportunity to become citizens is a tremendous opportunity. We are all, Rabbi Cooper alluded to this, other people alluded to this, we are all beneficiaries of that. The idea that says we can live here on an equal footing without regard for who our parents were, where they came from, that is the great blessing of American life. But there was a significant qualifier attached to that, which was if we wanted to be citizens in these new states, emerging states, enlightened states, Germany, France, the United States, we needed to get that new passport, and we needed to, in effect, redefine ourselves as Jews by religion. We needed to, in effect, take on a new political identity. So we became Germans, but unlike our Lutheran or Catholic neighbors, we were Jews. We went to a synagogue. And that, of course, is what you saw on the news last week from Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. Jews who see themselves as citizens of the state of Pennsylvania, residents of the city of Pittsburgh, they go to the Tree of Life congregation, and they were joined in sorrow and fellowship with their fellow members of the Pittsburgh community, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, etc., etc. The national piece is what they share, the American piece, and the religion piece is private. One is public, one is private, one is state, one is church. That has worked, I think, brilliantly for us. And by the way, it's been not only good as a civil integrationist thing, meaning enabling us to go to fancy schools, become professionals, make a lot of money, be prosperous, feel safe and secure. It's also been great for religion. Religion has flourished in this country precisely because it has been private. And it has been volitional. People choose. So the whole notion of congregationalism, of a free market of ideas, of institutions and the like, has been very, very good for religious life in the United States. Okay. But not everybody agreed with that. Some people, and now we get to our Zionist friends, some people say, yeah, but that's not Judaism. That's not really Jewishness. Jewishness shouldn't be private. It shouldn't just be about faith. It should be about peoplehood. And you got that American passport, so maybe you're more of an American than you are a Jew. And your Jewishness is cloistered. It's in private. It's in synagogues. It's not out on the street. And you don't talk a Jewish language anymore. So the whole cultural piece is sort of weakening. The sharpest critique, in effect, says the problem with a politics of integration that says you should depoliticize your identity and become a Jew by religion is that two things are going to happen, both of which are bad. Either it's going to work so well that you assimilate and become a Gentile, or it's going to work partially and then there will be pushback. People will say, your kid got my kid's spot at Princeton University. Your kid got my kid's spot in medical school. I don't want you as a neighbor. I don't want you as an associate in my law firm. I don't want you in my fancy club like Baltusrol. Anti-Semitism. And Zionism, in effect, doesn't grow out of a response to anti-Semitism per se, but what it does grow out of is a response that says, look, let's face it, Jewish life is abnormal. Normal is having your own land, having your own language, speaking it, having your own culture, governing yourself. We're not normal. And anti-Semitism is inevitably going to persist as long as we are abnormal. So, of course, what I'm describing here is a fundamental philosophical and practical argument that really goes on between those of us who make a choice that says, look, we want to live for philosophical and practical reasons in a liberal state like the United States, where the social contract of this place is that the state exists to serve the needs of every individual who lives here. Again, the beautiful part of this place is nobody cares who your parents were. Nobody cares where you came from. The job of the country is to enable you to have what? What's that beautiful language? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That's the job of the state. It leaves you alone. A magnificent amount of freedom. Some of us believe that that is a beautiful, amazing, universalistic vision that also gives us enough room to build synagogues, churches, mosques, etc. Other people say, yes, that's very nice, but the point is, the single most important thing about Jewish life is the fact that we are a nation. And therefore, we should be living together. So, okay, so that's an argument. That is a huge, profound argument. Now, of course, historically, who wins that argument? Up until 1948, then we'll jump into the Ben Gurion-Blaustein text. Who had won that argument? We got people here who are old enough to remember life before 19... Who wins the argument in terms of, you are, imagine here, you are VHS and Beta, or Steve Jobs and Bill Gates.
You've both invented a product, and now it's time to pound the pavement and try to get out there and sell your product. I just described for you two different products. One is a belief in the West, a belief in a politics and a life of integration in a liberal state like the United States. The second is a product that says, no, it's about Jewish self-government in this place, this tiny little place in West Asia that we call Palestine. In other words, that's not really a Jewish word. Eretz Israel is the Jewish phrase. Time to go out there and sell your product, to market it and sell it. Who wins? Who won? Diaspora. You bet. You bet. There are 500,000 Jews living in the Bronx alone before World War II. Israel, 1948, 600,000 Jews. It lost. Right? 3 million Jews, or even more by 1948 in the United States, somewhere north of 3 for sure. There are at least 2 in the tri-state area. Right? Before the Holocaust, of course, not even no question. There are 9 million Jews in Europe, another 3 or 4 in the Western Hemisphere. Israel had lost. Meaning Zionism was opposed by virtually every major, somebody mentioned the notion of isms. Liberalism, reform, orthodoxy, assimilationism, communism, socialism. Everyone opposed Zionism. Zionism was this crazy minority thing, crazy people like Ruth and Alex, studying their binyanim, going to Zionist camp, Beitar, Habonim, whatever. They were the crazies. Incredibly dynamic in terms of people's enthusiasm inside the Machaneh, inside these little sleeper cells of people. But the point was that it didn't succeed. Of course, what really changes that, in some ways, are both positive and negative things. The positive thing is that they kind of ran the table in terms of very smart leadership, Ben-Gurion, etc. And of course, this, obviously the single most traumatic experience in Jewish history, which is the destruction of the European Jewry. And all of a sudden, Jewry wakes up from this nightmare from 1939 to 1945, and the Jewish world has been transformed. And whereas before then, Palestine was a kind of a distant third in Jewish life to European Jewry on the one hand and American Jewry on the other, all of a sudden, Palestine is one of the 2 remaining major standing communities. And so that really, in effect, sort of sharpens this conversation. But it's very important to remember that Israel was not then what it is now, right? Fewer than 1 million people and the like. Of course, the document we're going to look at right now, it's already going towards 1 million people because the Sephardic Jews, the Mizrahi, are coming in large numbers. Okay. So, now just to introduce this document as we take a look at it together. So why the document? Zionism says a few things. It's the one that is, it's poorly reproduced. So it's kind of blurry, so I apologize for that. So we'll sort of schlep along with it. Zionism makes a couple of claims that are very scary for American Jews. One is, as I said before, the meta claim is Zionism exists to normalize Jewish life, which of course suggests that Jewish life outside of Israel is what? Abnormal. You're happy to go to your therapist and discuss your neuroses, but you don't necessarily want to be called out on that in public, and you certainly don't want the entire premise of your communal life regarded as sort of pathological or at the very least neurotic. And at some level, that's really what Zionism, you know, the wonderful thing about Zionism is there's a lot of negativity in it. It's very Jewish. Okay? There's a negative charge and there's a positive charge. The negative charge is a lot of self-criticism. This is the revolution, people. This is not like just hora and falafel and hummus. Okay, this is people who hated their parents, hated God, hated the rabbis, hated halakha, disagreed with tradition. They wanted to make something dramatically different, and they embraced discontinuity. The next time some knuckleheaded person says Jewish life is all about continuity, you can say, yeah, but you know what, if that were the case, we wouldn't have progressed. Sometimes it's about revolution too, it's about discontinuity. So Zionism is about discontinuity, it's about normalization. The big phrase, of course, is ingathering of the exiles and negation of the diaspora. Okay, so you're an American Jewish leader sitting there in 1950 dealing with this new state, 2 years old. The question is, how are you processing this language? Right? So that's one piece of backstory before we take a look at the text together. The second piece, of course, is the American Jewish community. Anybody here involved in the AJC? Ackerman, Lippitz, Ed. Oh my God, we got to, okay. The usual suspects, all right. All right, so anybody know what's the history of the AJC and Zionism? Ed, do you know anything about the history of it?
Kind of America first.
Okay. Well, that's, you short and sweet. You're wrong about the capitalism socialism thing, by the way, but you're right on the AJC. Alex was right on that, but that's all right. So Ed is absolutely right. AJC was America first, in the best sense, not in the Lindbergh sense of that term, that noxious term, which I know you did not mean, but America first meaning it's a view that says we embrace a political strategy of integration, we embrace being Americans, we embrace American democracy, we certainly in the Cold War context, we had just fought a war against totalitarianism and triumphed. We were then, by 1950, embarked, as some of you recall from your youth, on, in effect, a second struggle against what we viewed as another totalitarian foe, which was the Stalinist Soviet Union, i.e. the Cold War. So the AJC is very proudly, we're about Jewish life in America as Americans. They see themselves, again, in a very unapologetic way. You would not really recognize this today. Those of you who read the blogs of people like David Harris, the executive vice president, a very able, I think, thought leader, an institutional leader, you would not recognize this today. But the AJC was either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. Okay, meaning their only real hook into this whole notion of Zionism was, oh, we support it only as a humanitarian effort for Jews, not us. We don't need it. The Jews of Romania need it, but we don't need it. We also might, speaking of Hebrew language and culture, we also might like the cultural piece. We went back to figures like Ahad Ha'am, namely, oh yes, it's fine that, you know, they're speaking Hebrew there and sort of promoting Jewish culture. That's a good thing for the Jewish people. But they didn't see that as being, by definition, that wasn't the same thing as political Zionism. The AJC had been involved in the Jewish Agency in the 1920s. They wanted to be they didn't want to be out of the loop. So they had wanted to participate in the upbuilding of the land. They wanted to have a voice at the table. And in 1946, after the war, when the partition plan begins to gather steam, in international politics, the AJC says we will support it. But at that point, it's still not totally clear that the British are going to be out of it. There is a lot of internal hesitation about two things. One is, will Israel cause anti-Semitism? And two, in some ways even sharper for American Jews, and again, many of you lived through this, the fear of dual loyalty. The fear that other Americans will begin to see Jews, as you can use different terms from our political history, sort of the dark corner of our political history, as quislings, as a fifth column. Jews had a history of this. Those of you who came from families on the left may know that, for example, people were very anxious after the First World War, the Palmer raids, real crackdowns on civil liberties in American life after the Bolshevik Revolution. Jews were not, we have really blocked this out of our memories. It was so painful. One of my cousins, who was a boy in the 1930s, he said, on Sunday afternoons, Jews would gather around in their parlor rooms, they would put on the radio, and they would listen to Father Coughlin. Okay, you know who that was, everybody? Yep. Okay. And all of my grandparents and all of their siblings were all European. And they were almost all Russian. And you know what they would say when the radio went off? You know what they were afraid of? We're going to be deported. Think about this. The Depression, a damp labor market, to go back to political economics, they were afraid, you know what, the country may throw us out. So the point is, Jews had a lot of memories of, you know what, we're not so sure how secure we feel here. And the idea that another Jewish community is in effect going to put us in jeopardy by asking us to be politically committed to them, and in such a way that would jeopardize American perceptions of our loyalty, that's incredibly scary to people in 1950. So even though we tend to look at this as, oh, this is a bunch of assimilated Upper East Side Jews in the American Jewish community, that's really not fair to them. The point is, a lot of Jews were anxious still about what it meant to be an American Jew, people who came from Yiddish-speaking families, who had European parents. People are self-conscious about their Jewishness. So the point is, this is all of the baggage that Jacob Blaustein is carrying as he basically hears Ben-Gurion doing what? And I'll just share one very quick anecdote. A very good friend of mine. Do you have Stop and Shops here? Yeah. Okay. So the Stop and Shop family, the Rabb family, was a Boston Jewish family. And I happen to know the daughter of one of the founders. So she and her husband, two Bostonians, because their family gave a lot of money to the state of Israel, when David Ben-Gurion came to America, they got to meet him. This was in Boston, so he comes to they go up to meet the Prime Minister. He shakes their hands and he says, without missing a beat, when are you coming to Israel? And this was not like, when are you coming to the King David Hotel to eat the fancy breakfast, go around the country for 10 days, and then go home to Boston. This is, when are you coming on Aliyah? This is his default position. He's not apologizing for this. This is what he believes in. The Jewish national project. He says this about his own Aliyah. He says, I was reborn when I made Aliyah. This is the renaissance of the Jewish people. Every Jew has the obligation to live in Israel. I don't care if you just put in a new swimming pool in your house. I don't care if your kid just made partner at their law firm. Those are private matters. This is the most important event in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. You have an obligation to be there. This is for everyone. This is not just for the people who didn't make partner. So the point is, there is a real rub here. There is a real conflict between a community in America that has just lost parents, siblings, cousins, feels a responsibility to Jewish history, is anxious about the legacy of anti-Semitism from the 1930s, is anxious about the Cold War, is anxious about their Americanness, and an Israeli prime minister who is saying, look, this is all about normalizing you, teaching you Hebrew, getting you all here, getting you to fulfill your sense of obligation to this thing. That's a conflict. That's a huge conflict on every level. So that's really what this text is doing. So let's take a quick look. And then, see, since I'm a very competitive person, I always like to think about who wins and loses in these things. If you had a chance to look, I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't give this to you before. What struck you in terms of the tonality? Those of you who had a chance to look at it, or should we just sort of blow through it together? First of all, blow through it together, Dave? All right. So, first paragraph, always good to start with the first paragraph. Mr. Ben Gurion, we're very happy. Is that what you have too? Yeah. We're very happy to welcome you here in our midst as a representative of the great Jewry of the United States. There's a certain amount of puffery here, so you have to allow for that. To whom Israel owes so much. First of all, you know, good writing is about nouns and verbs. Adjectives and adverbs are just bloviate, so ignore those. Focus on the verbs. That first one, owes. What's the tonality of that? Right away.
Obligation.
Obligation. So he's being very deferential. Oh, we owe you so much. And of course that would suggest, in terms of the power relationship of the two, yeah, Israel owes the diaspora, meaning Israel small, America big. Right? Israel, you could say by extension. By the way, this was true of Ben Gurion. This is part of our own challenge in our own chapter of contemporary Jewish life. Ben Gurion's premise for a long time, really you could argue for sure at least until 1967, is that Israel is going to be a small and relatively weak state, surrounded by larger and stronger states. That is part of the shock of 67. That of course is completely stood on its head. So in other words, it isn't just like, he's not just saying this as a kind of a piece of rhetoric. First of all, it's true, Israel is a small and weak state in 1950. They got no money, they don't have enough housing for all the Mizrahi who are coming. In a few years hence, they will have this major battle over whether or not to accept money from the German government as reparations for war crimes that really, and Ruth in her scrapbook has a picture of Begin giving a talk, which really enables Begin to re-enter Jewish public life in Palestine as a Likud politician. So the point is, Israel's weak, it's small. So he says, yes, we are so grateful, we owe you so much, you are so big, you are so powerful, you are so generous. their material and political support, their warm-hearted and practical idealism, etc. Extending its help for the protection of Jewish rights throughout the world and of rendering economic aid whenever it was needed. This is also in the shadow of the Marshall Plan. America sees itself, again, both in the post-war context and the Cold War context, it's the best thing we can do strategically to try to promote democracy throughout the world. Israel, in effect, is another beneficiary of that larger set of values and strategies. And then he says, now he turns to Mr. Blaustein, and he says, you're a great example of that tradition as an American, as a Jew. We're happy, therefore, to have you come and to discuss matters of mutual interest. And then in the next paragraph he says, it's our great pride that our newly gained independence has enabled us in this small country. Right? He's really being very modest, really downplaying sort of the power of what he really thinks Israel signifies, because of course it's true, there is a gap between the hugeness of the vision and the fact that it's this tiny little country. Tiny little country with virtually nobody living in it. So, well, I mean, even then, it's somewhere around 1 million by 1950. So, again, smaller than the tri-state area. And he says we're engaged in a close partnership. Okay. So now here the rubber meets the road. Next paragraph. It's most unfortunate. Everybody see where I am? You have it? You don't have it?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Dark page, bottom paragraph.
Dark. What, Ricky?
Darkest page, bottom paragraph.
Okay. This is the most important paragraph. It's most unfortunate that since our state came into being, some confusion and misunderstanding, parenthetically because I keep stepping on my message, should have arisen as regards the relationship between Israel and the Jewish communities abroad, and particularly that of the U.S. These misunderstandings are likely to alienate sympathies and create disharmony where friendship and close understanding are a vital necessity. To my mind, the position is perfectly clear. The Jews of the U.S. as a community and as individuals have only one political attachment, and that's to the U.S., United States of America. They owe no political allegiance to Israel. In the first statement, right, without any reservation, the state of Israel represents and speaks only on behalf of its own citizens, and in no way presumes to represent or speak in the name of the Jews who are citizens of any other country. What kind of concession is that? Huge, meaning? What?
He presumes that there's some symmetry between the two, and if we don't go along with that, then there's something more than nothing.
Well, what do you mean by symmetry?
Well, dual allegiance.
Yeah, but what's he swearing off here?
Everyone's got something.
Yeah, first of all, he's not saying anything about Aliyah. But also, what is it, this thing about not speaking for world Jewry? Does Israel speak for world Jewry today?
Yeah.
Yeah, to some significant degree it does. And why? Well, it can, yeah, but why?
Because it's the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yeah, it sees itself as the nation state of the Jewish people, but actually I would say more than that, Dave. And it's actually interesting. Israel never came up with a constitution. But they had conversations and deliberations in 1948 to try to do that. So as they were working through that process that ultimately aborted, it didn't come to fruition, the AJC weighed in on different pieces of drafts. And when the Zionists proffered the language that Rabbi Ackerman just mentioned, meaning this is the state of the Jewish people, the AJC people said, strike that. It's not the state of the Jewish people, it's Israel. They are super sensitive to this idea. This isn't a state of the Jewish people. It's just a Jewish state. It's Israel. It's only for Israelis. That's huge, because the point is, philosophically, Israel sees it the way that Rabbi Ackerman sees it, which is that it exists for all of us. We are supposed to be it, and it is supposed to be us in some very profound way. And therefore, the premise of, oh yeah, of course, we are here, you know, the famous story, you know, Entebbe, right? A survivor was one of the people who was held captive. She said, when I was on the ramp in Auschwitz, I prayed for somebody to come for me, nobody came. When I was in Entebbe, the Israelis came. That's Israel. Israel is for all of us. So the point is, for him to back away from that here is a huge concession to Blaustein, the AJC. Yes, Rabbi Cooper.
Feel free to answer this later, but why should we presume that David Ben-Gurion is negotiating all future terms of the relationship between Israel and America in his conversation with Blaustein? Maybe it's just a fundraising call.
Good. So did everybody hear what Rabbi Cooper said? Well, I mean, why is he even doing this? What is this even about? Like, why? This is sort of a crazy example of an organization that, first of all, doesn't even speak for all. There's no such thing as American Jewry. Right? We're not like the Presbyterians. We don't have a sign on. I mean, the point is, it's just like a lot of organizations. First of all, at the same time, you should, first of all, did anybody here come from the American Jewish Congress? Were there any Congress people here? There are plenty of other organizations, many of which are very critical of the AJC. The Congress says, you know, you guys are basically blackmailing Israel. You keep saying, well, unless you do this and this and this, we will withhold your support, which is sort of the backstory to what Rabbi Cooper just alluded to, which is, why is Ben-Gurion even paying attention to these guys? And the answer is probably because he had a sense that, number one, these guys had the most access to American policymakers. Right? In other words, they were dialed in, they were significant enough in terms of American public life that he couldn't completely ignore them on that level. And number two was the even more topless piece that Rabbi Cooper just mentioned, which was they were major funders. And so he wanted to he wanted to play ball with them. At the same time, there is a way in which, you know, you can Google this on the AJC website and see the succeeding things. No sooner does he basically do this than he basically goes back to doing what he always really felt, which was, yeah, look, I'm here to talk about Aliyah. But, so in other words, there's a little bit of a, I'm not sure what to call it, there's a kind of a role play that's going on here. Blaustein is really acting out our anxiety as a community. We're afraid of dual loyalty charges. We're afraid of anti-Semitism. Israel is pushing our buttons about that. This is really early. We haven't accomplished, you know, the whole idea of Jews having a separate politics is strange to us. So we're acting that out, and Ben-Gurion, in some ways, in a kind of almost in a both a political way but also in a therapeutic way, is kind of acknowledging that. At the same time, is he going to stop trying to push Aliyah? No, although it is true, I mean, we know this unfortunately. What is the history of Zionism in the West? If you define Zionism as Aliyah, what's the history of Zionism in the West? It's a failure. So in that sense, of course, in some ways the AJC sort of wins this. The other people who are really pissed off by this whole exchange are the American Zionists. Because their attitude is, why is he talking to non-Zionists who don't even care about Palestine that much? He should be dealing with us. But that goes back to what Mark said, which is, yeah, but he wants, the whole point is he wants non-Zionists to become closer to Israel. Does he succeed in that, by the way? Yes. So the Zionists sort of get thrown under the bus, but he probably felt like you guys didn't need it anyway, because you were already going to Beitar and doing all these wonderful things, and you were going to continue to do that. Okay. After 67, this changes, yet again, they continue pressing on Israel. They continue pressing Aliyah even more in the euphoria after the Six-Day War. The last document, which, you had a comment, by the way, which I did not get to, I'm sorry.
Yes, because beyond Zionism, there was a support that generated out of these communities.
Good.
And whether Israel could have survived those early years without it, I'm not sure.
Right, so the last thing I want to say, and then we'll open up for a few questions. The thing that really changed, that I think Blaustein did not see coming, is how Zionistic the American Jewish community becomes. It's not an Aliyah Zionist, but it's a support Zionist. And so, I think also we become much less anxious about anti-Semitism, which, by the way, speaking of what Rabbi Cooper said at the outset, that's why the Squirrel Hill thing is so shocking. In other words, if God forbid this had happened in 1950, people would have a sense of, yes, you know what, I remember Father Godwin. I'm not surprised by this. But the fact that we live in such a state of integration, equality, acceptance, that's what makes Squirrel Hill incredibly destabilizing. So I think that Zionism has grown dramatically. The AJC, I mentioned David Harris, is now unflinchingly Zionistic. So this feels sort of quaint and archaic. If you read the Wexner thing, which is the thing that's much better printed, it's basically an attempt on a much more Judaic level to find points of commonality between the two. I frankly, have it. You can also go on, they have a website for that as well. I find this document, to be honest, much less interesting, in some ways because it's much less honest. The thing that I really like about the Blaustein-Ben Gurion one is that it really openly acknowledges these are different communities. We love Israel. We want to go there. We want to give money there. We want to send our kids there. We want our kids to come back from there. Right? We are still not an Aliyah community. We are organized along fundamentally different lines. And that's not, I'm not making a judgment about that. It is, as one of my rabbis, Bill Belichick, says, it is what it is. These are just two different communities. They grew up in different ways for different purposes. Israel, by the way, even though some of you, I'm sure, have Israeli family and the like, Israel now speaks in a much more PC way about we're two equal communities. I don't really believe that, frankly, meaning that when you really push Israelis, including Israeli school kids, by the way, and they come to American Jewish schools, they will start off on a PC level, talking, we're equal, I'm not comfortable with Israel being the center. Then about 20, 35 minutes into the conversation, they're back to basically saying, we are the center, you are the periphery. That is a good Zionistic perspective. That's what Zionism was for. Okay, I've talked enough. I wasn't like Dickens, I didn't negotiate payment by word, so I'm going to stop talking now. So, other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I grew up in a very secular household.
Yeah.
When Israel became a country, our family and most of our neighbors felt that it was a place for European Jews to have somewhere to go. They never thought of it as a place for the American Jews to go.
Absolutely, and that was, I would say, thank you for saying that it was for other Jews. It was for those poor, bedraggled people in the newsreels from the DP camps. And for the people from behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't for us. Absolutely. No, virtually no American Jews thought that. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Yes, sir.
So when Israel's created, it's also seen not just as a Jewish experiment, but as a socialist experiment.
By the socialists, anyway.
So for someone like my father who loses his security clearance, that's the attraction of Israel.
Yeah.
How does that change now that Israel is not a socialist experiment, but is a theocracy?
Great question.
Well, that's a great, you packed a lot into that one. Well, first of all, just in the interest of historical accuracy, it was a socialist. And by the way, if you read the Blaustein language very closely, you will see also some degree of anxiety about the socialist piece of Israel too. Because remember, for Israeli socialists, that meant, in some ways politically, they were more plugged into what country? Still Russia. Stalin dies. Ruth, I don't know if you were there at the time. 53, you weren't there that early, right? 53? Okay, so Stalin dies in 53. There are Marxist kibbutzim that have, ceremonies marking his death. So American Jews are super self-conscious about that piece as well. In other words, it's not so clear what the whole America-Soviet piece is there. So, I think if the last comment about the theocracy piece, clearly that's one of the things that I think is on the table for Israel right now, which is to the extent that Israel was constructed, certainly in the minds of people like Ben-Gurion, as an exercise in creating a secular, modern Jewish civil society. That whole project is, it seems to me, up for grabs. There are a lot of people in Israel today who could not care less about that project. And just to engage in comparative politics for a second, the analogy that you might draw there is to Turkey. Right? Turkey is constructed in the 1920s, post-Ottoman by Ataturk, etc. We have to put the mullahs in a closet. We have to privatize Islam. We have to build a modern secular civil society that we call modern Turkey. Guess what? Religious people don't like being put in a closet. They keep pushing, they keep pushing. Erdogan, he's much more equivocal about that. And you could say the same kind of conversation is going on in Israel too, around the forces of religion vis-a-vis the secular state civil project. So it's a good comment. Thank you for sharing that. Other people who haven't talked yet, before we get, yes, ma'am.
I grew up in the early 50s in Cleveland, Park Synagogue.
Yeah.
It was a large congregation, all the congregations around us. These were a lot of, the Millers, the Ratners. Yet we were taught when we were coming up to school, a lot of the Chalutzim, we were taught all the very pro-Israel, very, maybe not to make Aliyah, but all the songs, in addition to a Hebrew education, we were taught the modern, the love of Israel and all the modern socialist kind of things. Is that what was going on though? But yet you saw two different camps. I'm just curious.
So here is, and I'm going to end here, because this is a nice circling back to Alex and Ruth. Because what you just shared, I think, is especially true of the conservative rabbi. And it's a part of, I think, a beautiful part of what it meant to be a committed conservative Jew, especially in the clergy space. But also part of the agony, maybe too melodramatic a term, but certainly the tensions. Because a lot of conservative rabbis were great believers in Jewish people, the Jewish people. They were committed Hebraism. I mean, Alex was a significant example of that, but he would have been very modest about it. I had many other classmates who loved Hebrew as well. Hebrew summer camp, they promoted Hebrew. Camp Ramah was born out of a very strong Hebraic vision. So the point is, these were people who really felt a very strong connection to kind of the miracle of the creation of the State of Israel, and they experienced some degree of tension as conservative rabbis, because on the one hand, their hearts were really in the East, but their mission was to teach and to preach Jews in the West in wonderful communities like the Park Synagogue in Cleveland and elsewhere. And there are many, many, and by the way, the seminary was not in that same place. Chancellor Finkelstein, may he rest in peace, was much, in some ways, closer to the AJC worldview. So these guys were lonely in some very deep ways in terms of the school that they loved, the alma mater that they loved, was not completely supportive of this, that's to put it mildly. And their lay people responded on a certain level, but like, what do you mean you're leaving me and moving to Israel? I thought you were going to be my rabbi forever. I thought you were going to be my camp director forever. So, you know, again, you can ask Ruth about this. This was the tug that conservative elites felt, because a lot of them really wanted to be there. So, thank you for sharing that. Yes, Rabbi.
Would you kindly make a brief statement about the current tensions between the Israeli government or Israeli society at large and North American Jewry, principally American Jewry, which seems to be locked in this struggle over non-Orthodox Judaism, pluralism, who has a right to shape the nature of the Jewish way of life within the borders of the State of Israel? Why can't, why would David Lau, the chief rabbi, make a disgusting comment about denying the fact that the Pittsburgh Jews were even in a synagogue, they were just in a community center, and the tension that gives rise to, where does that leave us today?
I think, did everybody hear Rabbi Cooper's question/comment about the tensions today? Look, I think, Rabbi, that we are, a part of me feels like it's especially bad, a part of me is completely unsurprised. And I don't think it's especially bad. That does not, I'm not minimizing at all what you're saying. I think there is a huge gap between these communities. I think there has always been a gap between these communities. The fact that Israel, to go back to your comment, is becoming increasingly dominated by religious forces is clearly problematic, because you have an orthodoxy in Israel that is constantly sort of looking over its shoulder at the Haredim, who are not even Zionists. They are trying to delegitimize diaspora orthodoxy, much less anybody else. So that's problem number one. But the other problem is that the things that we care about fundamentally, they don't. They don't care about religious pluralism. Their attitude, even those of them who come from the States and who have some degree of empathy with us, their attitude is, look, you know what? You really care? Move to Haifa. Come. When you go on Aliyah, when you as a community take Aliyah seriously, then you will have a seat at the table. Until then, this is just another chapter of diaspora Jews meddling in Israel. Your kids aren't in the army. You don't have a vote. So I think The things that we care about, the things that get a lot of publicity in the States, they don't care. You know, Israelis couldn't care less about the hotel. Couldn't care less. It's not their issue. It's our issue. We go on synagogue trips. We want to be able to put on talis and tefillin there. We want to be able to daven there. They don't care. It's not their issue. So it's really, really frustrating, but it's, you know, again, we're talking about two separate communities. Last word, woman in red.
I'm a little concerned because, and Israel is the Jewish homeland, the whole point of what you said before, and what happened at the end of the war, I'm not going to get into, but if we don't know, if you're saying they don't care, the next thing they're going to say is, you're not Jewish.
Well, no.
So where is this going to end?
I think Susan's comment, I think, is this issue of if they say the ultimate level of bad faith is each community in effect saying the other doesn't care about us. Each community is in effect broigas, to use a very good Hebrew term, at the other. You don't really get us. You don't really care about us. Their attitude is, look, we love you, but the point is, the way for you to show that you get that is to come. That's what we're here for.
But if they don't consider you to be Jewish,
well, that's why we have to keep Israel secular.
Isn't that what you're saying? That's the next step.
Well, that's the challenge. I think the next great challenge in Israel will be to keep the social contract secular, with religion relatively private, but that's going to be a battle. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Rabbi Starr. I'm going to ask your indulgence, please. We need to ask you to remain here, not only because we still have some important comments to listen to from Ruth and from Nomi Ackerman, but we're about to have on the premises of the synagogue religious school dismissal. And I want to say, now in my 21st year in my rabbinate here, none of you want to be in the parking lot during synagogue dismissal, during religious school dismissal. You just don't want to be out there. Just hang on here for a few minutes. I also want to go on record briefly as saying, as much as I revere and respect the memory of Rabbi Shapiro, and I certainly respect my colleague David Starr, I'm totally in with Ed on the idea that Judaism is 100% capitalist. Everything about us is capitalist, and there's no notion, I don't think, that we all have to live as socialists. That's my view of the world. I also, of course, want to acknowledge Rabbi David Ackerman and Rabbi Moshe Sachs, colleagues and family members of Ruth and Olav Shalom, Alex Shapiro. It's always good to have you here. We see you from time to time, Moshe, and we see you often here, David. Thank you so much for being here. Let me call on Ruth Shapiro to come forward and share a few words with us, and following her, we're going to ask Nomi to come up, who wants to say a few words to us today as well.
One man to follow.
Close to the mic. Close, just step close to the mic.
Okay. My comment is what an act to follow. Thank you so much, Professor Rabbi David Starr, for his important talk today. Professor Starr has been a longtime friend of our family, as he mentioned. He knew my husband well, and he epitomizes much about what Alex believed in and hoped would be developing in our community. I also want to thank Ed Zinbard for his moving remarks today. Ed and his wife Barbara, too, were close friends of my husband, and continue to be friends of my friends and all our family for many years. Thank you, Rabbi Cooper, whose work has really made today possible. who stepped in the absence of our committee chairman, who I also want to thank for the preparation work, and made the morning come off as it should. So thank you to the chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee, Hank Lickman, to Susan Blackburn and Esther Berg, who helped set it up this morning and who have done so much. And of course, to Betty Feinberg, who has generously supported this lecture for so many years, and whose husband we also remember today, who was also a great friend of Alex and mine. We meet today after tragedy and still in sorrow and shock after what happened in the Tree of Life Synagogue. As Rabbi Cooper and so many others have said, and I believe my husband would have said, the best response to hatred may be what has happened here today, what you have contributed to our present work, to continue the traditions of Judaism, of learning, of study, of affirming all that is Jewish and the people, and Israel and its people, and celebrating our history. Thank you all for coming. Somewhat unexpectedly, my daughter Nomi has asked to speak and say a few words, I think, about her father this morning. So I would like to introduce her now.
I'll be fast. Don't get scared by the bag. First of all, Dave, thank you. David and his wife Jennifer and their family are dear, dear friends, and we go back a long time. As the sort of custodian of some of the family history, before this morning's lecture, I remembered, and sort of in response to last week's events and the upcoming election, I might take this opportunity to remind everybody to vote without getting political, but I was reminded that in my collection at home, I happen to have both a photo album of those early Zionist days, but also a collection of memories and clippings about my father, some of which were put together, I believe, while he was here at Oev Shalom. And so, in searching for, we all say all the time, this is why I never speak. We often say after moments like this, what would Alex have said? Or what would Saba have said? And as many of you probably know, back in 1963, in May of 1963, my father was one of 20 rabbis chosen by the Rabbinical Assembly to go to Birmingham in a demonstration of solidarity for those in Birmingham in those days. And amongst the collections is a postcard that he wrote to us that I hold very dear. For a little bit of humor, as any of you have ever tried to read his handwriting, it's not so easy. But I will share to you these words, and my mother will help me if I need it. I was obviously not born yet, so it's addressed to Dear Ruthie, Meira, Adina, and Avi. I am writing this note. Here we go. In the thought that it will be received after I get home, I do it so that you may know that your daddy, your Abba, at least tried to be in the right place at the right time for the sake of man and God. Love, Abba. So I think we all need a lot of reminders, courage, and strength in the days ahead. And I thought that might offer some encouragement.
Thanks to all of you for being here today. Quick program reminder that this Friday night our speaker series continues at Oev Shalom. We have an 8 o'clock service and an 8:30 presentation. My wife Amy Skop traveled to the West Bank, to Ramallah and to Bethlehem on an encounter with Palestinians. This is not a political presentation. This is not about taking an approach to what should happen in the West Bank or a two-state solution. It is a social, personal, human encounter with the people who live in the West Bank, getting to know them, and she will present her views and her experience of what she did there. That's 8:30 this Friday night, and I encourage everyone to be here for the next installment of our speaker series. I could stand here and recite the rest of the year's programming, but I'm going to decline to do that. I am hoping that enough time has passed so that good. So, thank you all for being here. We ask that one person at each table collect the Birkat Hamazon cards so that our very hardworking staff does not need to worry about them falling into the trash. So thank you very much for coming, and have a great day.